registers versus dialect. When asked to think about the different varieties of a language, like the different varieties of English, many people immediately think of dialects. For example, it's easy to notice the people from the Southeast United States talk differently from people in Wales, and that the English used in Singapore is different from both. Two main kinds of dialect are commonly distinguished in linguistics. Geographic dialects are varieties associated with speakers living in a particular location, while dialects are varieties associated with speakers belonging to a particular demographic group. Example, women versus men, or different social classes. Many recent dialect studies have used a comparative approach to study social dialects, describing the linguistic patterns of variation across social groups in major urban centers such as New York City, Norwich, Belfast, and Montreal. When dialects are studied, analysis usually focus on linguistic features that are not associated with meaning differences. Phonological differences are often studied, such as pronouncing or omitting the R in part. Clearly, in this phonological variation results in no meaning difference, but it does say a great deal about the region or social group that the speaker identifies with. Similarly, the grammatical and lexical features included in studies of dialect variation are selected so that they do not reflect a meaning differences. Example, the use of double negatives in African American vernacular English versus single negatives in mainstream upper middle class English, or the use of synonymous words like soda versus pop versus soft drinks. Such linguistic differences are not functional, rather, social linguists urge that these are arbitrary differences where one's linguistic form is conventional associated with a social group. In this regard, the linguistic variables used in register studies are exactly the opposite from those used in dialect studies. Registers variables are functional as opposed to dialect variables, which are conventional. This difference is reflected in the way that linguistic variables are operationally defined in two subfields. Linguistic variables in dialect studies almost always consist of choice between two linguistic variants. The variable scores is a proportion showing the relative preference for one the other variant. In contrast, linguistic variables in register studies are usually rates of occurrence for a linguistic feature in a text, and a higher rate of occurrence in interpreted as reflecting a greater need for the functions associated with the future. It is, of course, possible to investigate the existence of functionally motivated linguistic variation across dialects. However, most sociolinguists exclude this possibility because of their theoretical philosophical stance that all dialects are equivalent in their communicative potential. We return to this controversy in Module 10. Comparing register variation and dialect variation. Although most sociolinguistic studies have traditionally focused on linguistic differences among dialects, the linguistic differences among registers are usually more extensive. When speakers switch between registers, they are doing different things with language. Using language for different communicative purposes and producing language under different circumstances, the associated linguistic differences are functionally motivated, related to these differing purposes and situations, and thus the linguistic differences among registers are often dramatic. In contrast, dialect differences are largely conventional, expressing a person identity within a social group. Regardless of any dialect differences, speakers using the same register are doing similar communicative talks. Thus, therefore, in most basic respects, the characteristic language features used in a given situation are similar across speakers from different dialects. To illustrate, compare the language used in the following two conversations, one between a working class husband and wife in Hampshire, England. Text sample 1.2 and the second between a middle class husband and wife in Devon, England. The speakers in these two conversations are from different social dialects and different geographic dialects if you heard the conversation. The speakers will probably sound quite different, but there is only one obvious grammatical dialect marker that distinguishes the two. The use of don't with a third-person singular subject in the working class conversation, that don't stop it and don't get on her nerves, because dialect markers such as this are often highly stigmatized. A relatively rare occurrence of a few features can serve as an important indicator of dialect differences. Overall, so the most striking aspect of comparison between the two conversations is how similar they are. Situationally, the two conversations are very similar in their production, circumstances, primary purposes, and interactiveness. Both conversations are spoken rather than written, and they are produced in real time, with the words and grammatical organization being produced on the spot as the conversation unfolds. There is little time to plan ahead and virtually no opportunity to edit afterwards. In addition, both conversations are personal and directly interactive. Conversational partners express their own personal attitudes, feelings, and concerns, and they interact with one another to build a shared discourse. These characteristics are tied to convention as a register and are thus not affected by dialect differences. The contextual characteristics shared by these two conversations have important linguistic correlates, and as a result, the conversations are very similar linguistically. For example, the speakers in both conversations are planning what to say at the same time that they are actually speaking. As a result, both conversations have generally short sentences, and many utterances are not structurally complete sentences at all, assuming the traditional concept of a grammatical sentence. This later including simple responses why, yeah, no, oh, of course, as well as utterances that build on the shared physical context to supply missing information. Example, it doesn't work like that. Both conversations also have numerous contracted or reduced forms such as what's, it's, she's, that's, don't, you've, cause, gonna. In addition, the participants in both conversations assume familiarity with other people in the physical context. As a result, references to people, objects, and places are often not explicitly identified. Example, she either gets on with it or gets rid of them. Put quite a few lines in there. The interactive nature of conversation results in further linguistic similarities between these two texts. For example, both conversations have frequent references to I, the speaker, and you, the address. Similarly, there are frequent questions in both. Example, what's the alternative? Why does it? Will not you? Do you see what I mean? Don't you? Alright. The extent of the similarities between these two conversations from different dialects can be further illustrated by comparing them to a sample from a written informational register. Text sample 1.4 is taken from a university textbook. Text sample 1.4 system analysis textbook. The method for information system inquiry, known colloquially as means by the research project team, specifically addresses the problem of structuring the approach to information studies. It uses system thinking to develop ideas about what information is needed to achieve a defined purpose. Ideas that are independent in the first instance of how this information appears in practice. In the process, an information model is built up on a computer database which is then used as a framework to explore the situation and identify problems at a number of levels. The situational characteristics of the textbooks are very different from those of the conversation. The textbook is produced in writing, carefully planned, revised, and edited. The text is not interactive. It is addressed to a large audience of students and professionals, but the writer and audience are not directly involved with each other. The primary purpose of the text is to present information about systems analysis as opposed to the interpersonal purposes of conversational participants. Due to the influence of these situational factors, the linguistic characteristics of the textbook are dramatically different from those of the conversational text. The sentences of the textbook are all grammatically complete and are often quite long and complex. None of the reduced or interactive linguistic characteristics common in conversations occur in this text. However, textbooks do contain numerous linguistic characteristics rarely found in conversation. In text sample 1.4,